Welcome, everybody. I'm Tweed Roosevelt, and I'm delighted you're joining us today. Thank you for coming. Uh, just a little about me. I'm at Long Island University, where I am chairman of the Roosevelt School and also a university professor. And I am delighted to be bringing you now this series. This is the first in a series that happened to start once a month, and a little more about that. Uh, but today we're going to do what we will do some of the time, which is interview an important author. The subject of these podcasts or webinars is presidential studies. And it's brought to you by Long Island University and the Roosevelt School, which is focusing on presidential studies, and also something called the Society of Presidential Descendants, which is exactly what it sounds like. I started it recently. There was no organization for that. And they are sponsoring this too. Little technical thing, we are unable to take direct questions as we go forward. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, I think, a little chat area. And if you click on that in the chat, you'll get both James Reed, our author today, and my emails, and you can send us any questions, comments, improvements, whatever you want, rant and rave if you want, and send it to us. We'll be happy to answer it. So I want to start off with introducing James Reed, who I've known for some time, and I consider now a friend. He's a professor of political science. Even though he's a professor of political science, I welcome him here, and we're good friends. He's at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University in Minnesota. That's quite a mouthful for me. He has a very impressive resume. He's authors of all kinds of things, including several books. And the one we will be discussing today, I don't know if I can show it to you, but it's called Sovereign of a Free People, Abraham Lincoln, Majority Rule, and Slavery. It is a fascinating book. It's a difficult book. It's a political science book, not a history book. And it's fascinating and very relevant to today. So I hadn't finished introducing James. He received his PhD from my alma mater, Harvard University, in 1988. I won't tell you when my degree came from. And he lives in Avon, Minnesota. He's a Minnesotan all the way back, I gather. And although he isn't beaten up, I would have thought he would be, he serves as the chair of his little city's planning board, which I know about because I live in a small town too. It seems to me that's a role that gets everybody mad at you all the time. So I imagine you could tell us stories of that. But now let's just get down to the book and get to it. As I say, it's a very well worth reading book, and I hope you do get a chance to read it. And I hope we can address some issues today that are both relevant from a historical point of view and have modern constructions or modern, you can bring something to the situation we face today. We're not going to talk about that. We leave that up to you. We'll talk about the historical part of it. So let's get started, James. One of the major issues facing any system based on majority, spit that out, majority rule, faces a fundamental issue of how to protect the minority. What was Lincoln's position on this, and what are your thoughts about it?
Okay, well, first I want to thank Tweed Roosevelt for inviting me to do this, and thank you to the Society for Presidential Descendants and Long Island University. Yes, Abraham Lincoln was, on the one hand, strongly committed to majority rule. He thought that was the only form of rule that was worthy of free, equal citizens. He also understood that majority rule could become tyrannical and despotic. He didn't believe that the majority was always right. So he had put a lot of thought into ways in which majority rule could be made. There was no guarantee that majority rule would always be wonderful and wise, but there are ways in which you can improve the probability that it will be deliberate and thoughtful and bring about just outcomes. And Lincoln at the same time was deeply opposed to and worried about tyranny by the minority. So tyranny from Lincoln's point of view could come both either from a majority. Majority tyranny would take the form of mob rule, which Lincoln feared may could cause a democracy to commit suicide. Mob rule was really the great danger that majority rule could fall into, but also minority rule. Much of what Lincoln was doing in his opposition to slavery was opposing the power of a wealthy, privileged, politically dominant, and often violent minority that demanded that it always get its way. So I think to understand Lincoln, he supported majority rule. He understood how it could go wrong, but he also believed that majority rule was the only fair way, and that the alternatives, rule by minority or anarchy, were worse than that. Um, and if I would like to read just a quote that where the title of my book, "Sovereign of a Free People," comes from. This is from Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. And the context is that 7 states, slave states of the lower South, had already seceded from the Union before Lincoln could even take office because they didn't like the results of the 1860 presidential election. Those same 7 states, if their candidate, John Breckinridge, had won, would have stayed in the Union and demanded that the free states respect the election results. So that's the context of Lincoln's defense of majority rule. Lincoln says in that inaugural address, a majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinion and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. And then he goes on to say why the alternatives, either anarchy or that unanimity, all of us coming to agreement, is impossible. Rule by minority is worse, so that majority is the only fair way to rule. But he doesn't say majority can do anything it wants. It's got to be a majority that respects constitutional checks. That would be things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, that it follows election rules. He also says that it should be a deliberate majority rather than a gut, as opposed to, say, a unthinking gut reaction majority. So those are his thoughts. He was one of the things when you write a book on Lincoln, somebody asks you, people ask you, what can you say that hasn't been said before? And the interesting thing is, central as this idea of majority rule is to Lincoln's thought, there's been remarkably little written about Lincoln's understanding of majority rule. So that's a long way of saying that you mentioned this is a difficult book. It's a difficult book in the sense that it's not a biography of Lincoln. You could call it a kind of biography of an idea that Lincoln held. So this brings me into, not only about Lincoln's own words and thoughts, but also looking at democratic theory. How have political theorists thought about issues of majority rule and how majority rule can be lead to a prosperous country rather than descend into tyranny?
One of the things that strikes me, well, let's sticking for a moment with the majority. I'll go on to the minority in a minute, but from a majority rule, and maybe I'm confused about this, but majority of what jurisdiction seems to me of interest, because there was a lot of talk about states, free states or states that are not free yet. What do they do, and how do they do it? And it seemed to me he was in favor of majority rule in those states, but when you look at the South, they were clearly their own majority rule was in the opposite direction. So how does that work out?
Well, I mean, so Lincoln understood. So his defense of majority rule really is stated in general form. It would be true at all levels of jurisdiction that a majority rule by majority is better than what the alternatives. But then there's the question of over which domain of issues, and on issues that are genuinely national. For Lincoln, he argued that has to be a national majority addressing those questions. So, for instance, the question of whether slavery would be permitted to spread to every territory not yet a state. That is a national issue. That's not a that people that the that's not really a states' rights issue. That is a issue for the whole nation to decide because it affects the future of the whole country. Similarly, issues like what happens with fugitive slaves. What are Can slaveholders take enslaved persons with them when they travel in free states like New York? So these are all national issues. And from Lincoln's point of view, because they were national issues, they ultimately had to be decided by a national majority. It couldn't be the state of South Carolina deciding on its own that it can bring slaves to any territory it wants and bring enslaved persons to the state of New York.
And there are many, many issues like that. Even today, we have issues of what happens on states and so on. On the minority side, I mean, it was pretty clear that the slaveholders were a minority in the South. And they managed to totally overcome the objection that most of the followers of you were not slave owners, never would be slave owners. And so what do you make of all of that?
Well, there's a large literature on the non-slaveholding white Southerners, and ultimately most of them supported the Civil War on the Confederate side. There were places like North Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, Maryland were very divided. So as a wealthy, powerful minority can dominate a majority, especially if they control the economy. The slaveholders, controlled the economy of the southern states, especially in the lower South. So that the non-slaveholding white citizens, I know Lincoln and the Republican Party hoped to enlist non-slaveholding white Southerners to turn them into critics of slaveholder and to supporters of the ultimate abolition of slavery. And there were some very vocal white Southerners who were opposed to slavery. But what the slaveholders did is a couple of things. They sold many white Southerners who didn't own slaves on the idea that even though they weren't wealthy and didn't own slaves, their white skin made them aristocrats. They were privileged by white skin, and for that reason, they were like an aristocracy compared to this black underclass. And they were completely unashamed in making this argument. So that was part of it. So, racial pride, stirring up ideas of racial superiority, worked to a degree in the South. And the second thing was when you have somebody who's very wealthy, even if you're not wealthy yourself, often you look up to them as something that you aspire to. So many white Southerners, although they did not own slaves, hoped maybe at some point in future to become wealthy enough to own slaves. And they certainly, did business with slaveholders. They supplied slaveholders with agricultural equipment and all kinds of things. So in that kind of way,
they also competed.
Yeah. But it's also, but it is the case that if you just look at the actual economic conditions of many white non-slaveholders in the South, they were just barely scraping by.
So one could argue that this is a sort of a magic show.
I think Lincoln was distressed that the Republican Party was principally a Northern party. He won the presidential election in 1860 almost entirely on free state votes. There were some from the border slave states, but he hoped over time at least to enlist um, white non-slaveholding Southerners in this idea of ending slavery because Lincoln really believed it did not do, for non-slaveholding white people, they were not as victimized by slavery as enslaved persons themselves were. But Lincoln firmly believed that slavery uh, threatened the rights of everyone, including non-slaveholding white Americans, and that's where he hoped to get votes.
Didn't convince them, obviously. I mean,
Well, no, but it is the case actually. It's still worth noting that when the first seven slave states seceded from the Union before Lincoln could even take office, Virginia did not, North Carolina did not, Arkansas, Tennessee, all those late. It was a so there. Those are the states where you would have the real divisions, and it was only the assault on Fort Sumter that forced them off the fence. So, and then you still have Missouri, Kentucky, where Lincoln himself was born, Delaware, Maryland, slave states that never seceded. So he wasn't entirely off on his hope that he could win over non-slaveholding white citizens. He just exaggerated how much support they would actually bring.
and of course, in a sense, I mean, you had to get more than half to make it matter.
Yeah,
And of course,
right.
he got near that. What percent, let's talk about some of these things. I'm more interested in the economics of things.
Mhm.
What percentage of Southern whites were slaveholders? It must have been very small.
Well, it in South Carolina and Mississippi, um, percentage of white slaveholders was of white citizens who held slaves was pretty large, larger than in the other states.
What do you mean by large?
Well, I think it was. I'm just guessing here. I would say probably in South Carolina may have been maybe 35 to 40%
Minority.
of white families owned some slaves. And it's also the case that in both of those states, South Carolina and Mississippi, by 1860, enslaved persons were the majority of the population.
Mhm.
And so majority rule, the whole idea of majority rule, if you live in a state where you're a slaveholder and the majority of your population are enslaved persons, you're going to be nervous about any kind of talk about majority rule.
Yeah, yeah. And it's when you look at the soldiers in the Civil War, Southern soldiers, Confederate soldiers, uh, they of course were a vast majority of them didn't own slaves, and it could be argued were willing to make the ultimate cost for a policy that basically hurt them.
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the tragedies I see of the Civil War, that once you start a war, which Lincoln did not want a war. He did not want a war for the purpose of ending slavery. He One of the points I make in the book is that he hoped and believed that slavery could be gradually and democratically abolished. That's not the course that history took, and partly it didn't take that because the Confederacy and the state of South Carolina made a decision to start a war over this. Once you do that, and there are federal armies marching through your state, you're going to defend your own community, your own state. So I think that's very natural. At that point, you may not own slaves. You may not have. You may be a white slaveholder, a white non-slaveholder in Tennessee, for instance, resentful of the power and wealth and arrogance of the slaveholders in your state. But when a Union army starts marching through your state, you're going to feel like you have to close ranks and defend your own community. So I think that's really, I think that's probably the main reason that you found so many of the white
Even though
slaveholders in the South willing to risk their lives to defend what they saw as their own community.
even though it might have been against their own self-interest.
Well, I mean, yes, it certainly ultimately, they ultimately took a big loss, right? I mean, not slavery was abolished, so the slaveholders took a big economic loss, and the loss of life on both sides, and especially among the Confederate, non-slave holders, was enormous.
What
So you could say in that sense it was clearly in some sense not in their interest to have gone to defend the slaveholders in that way.
what percentage of the wealth in the house in the South was bound up in the value of slaves?
I believe it was more than half. I couldn't give you exact, but I think that for the in terms of the value of property, it was more than half of the value of property. It was enslaved persons were worth more than land. They were worth more than cash in the bank, and that also means, that to abolish slavery, even gradually, meant that somebody was going to be taking a very big economic hit. Now, if you're an enslaved person, right, you're going to gain from that. But for the slaveholders, they were and for the economies of slaveholding states, they were looking at the abolition of slavery would have meant an enormous economic disruption. And that's not a defense of what they did, but it makes it understandable why people would go to war to defend that large of an economic interest.
Well, people think about the Civil War don't take that into account. If as much that's as much of a change for you, for one, you can see why they reacted this way. I think it's even more than that, because one of the reasons, and let's see what you think about this, one of the reasons that was put forward was, well, we could do the gradual elimination of slavery. Why don't they be reasonable? We'll pay for slaves. We'll give them the money. Well, that misses the point that the slaveholders looked at this as not just their good over their lifetime, but their children and their grandchildren and their grandchildren. And if they gave into this, they were basically giving in to their great-grandchildren being paupers. I mean, I'm overstating.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that certainly is the way they looked at it, right? I think from Lincoln, of course, Lincoln hoped to convince them that a different kind of economy could come along that would give economic mobility to everyone. And so, so you wouldn't have to, so your children's and grandchildren's economic futures would not need to depend on the continued institution of slavery. But for the slaveholders, yes, as you put it, they viewed this as we would be selling out our children and grandchildren because they would no longer have this very wealthy, privileged, genteel way of life that we have been enjoying. So since we mentioned the idea of a gradual abolition of slavery, if you were an enslaved person, that would seem outrageously slow. If you're an enslaved person, you want slavery to end today, right? The problem and ultimately slavery was abolished quickly and violently. The problem is that before the Civil War itself, the only way that you could abolish slavery quickly was in a massive civil war, which Lincoln did not want. Had Lincoln commenced the Civil War for the purpose of violently abolishing slavery, I think the Union would have lost that war. He would not have had the political support for a preemptive war on the institution of slavery. It was the fact that the slaveholders themselves started the war in rejection of the results of a free election that gave Lincoln enough political support to carry this very difficult war effort through 4 years. The idea of a gradual abolition of slavery, it's not that it was unrealistic from the slaveholders' point of view. It was too realistic. They looked at it and said, yes, this could actually be done. And so just to take an example, part of the platform of the Republican Party was to prevent the spread of slavery to the territories not yet states. Once you've prevented the spread of slavery, then the value of your slave property is going to take an immediate hit, right? It's no longer portable. So slaveholders would have taken an immediate economic hit. They also then would have lost the supply of new slave states to preserve the balance of slave and free states. So they would be increasingly outvoted in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House, as well as being made more economically marginal. So it would have been a kind of abolishing slavery through this long, slow containment, geographical containment, to squeeze it out to make it politically and economically more marginal, so that ultimately the thinking was, for Lincoln and many others, that the slaveholders themselves would eventually accept a kind of buyout of slaves, that federal money would come in, liberate the slaves. They would get some compensation for the lost private property. You would avoid a civil war, but of course, those slaveholders and their would be economically much less well off than they were before. For the enslaved persons, of course, it's a different story. For, like I said, for enslaved persons, it probably would make sense to prefer a civil war over slavery than to continue, another 30 or 40 years in slavery.
I agree, although they, of course, were pretty much powerless. I think another thing that was playing, let's go back a little bit to the non-slavehold people.
Mm-hmm.
There was this, I think, zero-sum view very strong in the South. If the blacks are freed, and I'm, not a slaveholder, but sort of a middle or lower class white, the sudden influx into the market of a larger number of workers could only greatly dispel the going price for your labor. So that's zero sum. Lincoln,
Yeah.
tell me what Lincoln would have thought about that.
Lincoln systematically challenged this idea of a zero sum economy. So, that idea, the way that he phrased it was, he says people believe that the economy is like a ship that's sinking and there's only one plank, and to save himself, the white man has to push the black man off the plank. And Lincoln says that's, if that were the case, it would not make the race of the person you're pushing off the plank wouldn't make any difference. You would push a white man as soon as a black man off of a plank if you were in that situation. But then he denied that was the case. That he said, and this is speeches he gave in the late 1850s, and early 1860, before he was elected president, the plank is large enough for all. And so he believed a commercial economy, a free labor economy, was one in which there was room for everyone, for both races and also for immigrants. Lincoln supported immigration. He believed the United States could grow the economy for everyone. So the zero-sum ideas, and this is important because it's not limited to his time. You see similar ideas today. Some of the forms it took in Lincoln's time, slaveholders repeated endlessly that if the slaves were freed, that would mean we white people would be enslaved. That's a sort of, it's almost ludicrous. Did anyone actually, did that literally think that they were going to be reduced to chattel? I don't think anyone believed that literally that would happen, but it was more like to go from the height of privilege and power that we now have to having to compete on an equal level with this other group of people would be like being enslaved. So that's one form. Another form that Lincoln had to counter the zero-sum thinking was among white working class people in the North. And here it resembles, anti-immigrant arguments that for many white working class people in the North, they were not admirers of slavery. They probably recognized it was wrong, but their worry was that if slavery was abolished, then these former enslaved persons would come north and start competing with them for jobs. So Lincoln took this on directly and several points. And so he will say you don't want to compete with a black man's labor. Lincoln's answer was, "You are already competing with black man's labor because they are working for free. They are working. They're forced labor. They're working for free, which means you are already competing with them under the worst possible economic circumstances. If slavery is abolished, those formerly enslaved persons will start demanding wages. And if they have to be paid wages, that will also bring your wages up. So it's a I think economically his argument is correct. It's hard to persuade people that it was hard to persuade people then, hard to persuade people now that new people coming into the economy aren't taking it away from you. But for Lincoln, he was very consistent in making the argument that there is not this fixed pie or this one little plank that everybody has to stand upon, that there's under the right circumstances, there's a possibility of increasing economic prosperity and increasing freedom for everybody.
I don't think that argument, I mean, I agree with you, but I don't think that argument made much traction with both the Southern and the Northern, people who are concerned about having their jobs replaced or competing them. So I don't think he really succeeded in that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he was trying. You always, like I said, that the argument that somebody else entering the labor market does not necessarily deprive you of work. If you had a static economy, that might be the case. But the United States economy at that point, was a very dynamic economy, and from Lincoln's point of view, I mean, he believed in economic growth. He believed in the possibility of both a political system and an economic system that, as he would say, lift the artificial weights from the shoulders of everyone and make possible both economic and political advancement for everyone.
Yeah, another example of this, by the way, is Malthus, who convinced everybody we were all going to starve to death, and that didn't work because of
So I don't know whether Lincoln read Malthus, but his argument is very much an anti-Malthusian argument. It's the idea that there's only one plank, and if to survive you have to push somebody else off. That's really like a parable of Malthusian economics, and Lincoln very, very directly and consciously rejected that.
Yeah, I think so. Because this is sponsored by the Roosevelt School, and because I'm a Roosevelt, I got to bring TR in here somehow. So I thought I'd bring him this way. TR was a very practical politician, real politic, that's idea. He believed that the White House represented a tremendous opportunity for whoever wanted to be the occupant of the White House. But what that person had to do was be very careful about what he chose to take on. And Lincoln's is similar to this. He realized he had about 5 views, 5 issues he wanted to take. He stuck to those. And the way he defined them was, he said, look, I want them all to be achievable. I want them all to have a shot. They don't have to be easy. The easy ones are fine. But pick the 5 or 6 that you want to do that are actually achievable. And I think, tell me how that applied to Lincoln.
Well, yes, of course, the specific issues were different in Lincoln's time than they were in TR's time. But for Lincoln had a very keen sense of what was politically possible at any given time and what was not. He also had a good sense of how circumstances changed to make something possible at time B or time C that wasn't possible at time A. And so in that sense, he contrasted, the big contrast is with the radical abolitionists. So for the radical abolitionists, their position was slavery is completely unjust. It should be not only prohibited in the territories, it should be prohibited everywhere. It should be prohibited, it should be abolished not just gradually, it should be abolished today. And at every hour that somebody is living in servitude is, a outrageous violation of human rights. And morally, they were entirely right. And Lincoln even recognized that they were morally right.
And
The
he believed it himself. I mean, if he had his no constraints, would he have eliminated slavery immediately? If there'd been
Yes, Lincoln acknowledged that slavery was a complete violation of human rights, and uh, he he understood that it was he understood everything about the abolitionist argument. The problem was neither he nor the abolitionists nor anyone else at the time had the power to bring about that outcome, except through a massive civil war, which, like I said, Lincoln didn't want, and most of the abolitionists did not want either. And so, uh, and even during the Civil War itself, where Lincoln that by that point was much more in sync with the abolitionists, and they warmed up to him somewhat, and he warmed up to them. Even then, Lincoln had a very keen sense of what was possible when. Um, there's a really good recent book by Richard Ellis called Lincoln's Last Card, about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and one of the things that I admire about this book is how he describes Lincoln's sense of the enormous constraints that Lincoln was under. Uh, most people at the time and most people today don't understand how really difficult the constraints were under which Lincoln operated during the Civil War. And in a sense, those who demanded from the beginning that Lincoln abolish, the beginning of the war, that abolish all the slaves, abolish all slavery everywhere, had no real understanding of what the constraints were under which he operated. And so he had a good sense of timing. The other thing about Lincoln, too, is that if he did make mistakes. There's no question Lincoln made mistakes, but when he made mistakes, he admitted them, learned from them, and tried something different the next time around. So there is a lot of learning by trial and error that Lincoln did that made him successful.
the mob rule thought?
Yeah.
You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yes, well, this is really Lincoln's earliest political statement, his Springfield Lyceum address of 1838, was on the theme of mob rule. And there had been lots of lynch mobs in occurring at the time, many of them directed against free persons of color or directed against abolitionists, abolitionist publishers. And Lincoln, in that address, expressed, on the one hand, his great belief and hope in government by the people, the capacity of the people to govern themselves, if they respected the rules and processes that made popular self-government possible. So, like I said, the majority functions is not a sovereign of a free people just by being majority. It has to act in accordance with certain rules and constitutional limitations. And what a mob does is ignore all those things. A mob says, basically, we're the people, we can do whatever we want. And anyone who's not with us is not really part of the people anyway. So if there's a dissenter there, it's not like a mob is going to take votes to decide what to do. It's not as though they're going to respect the views of dissenters. No, if you're a dissenter and there's a lynch mob, you may be the target of the lynch mob yourself. And Lincoln feared that, especially in the government based on the principle of the sovereignty of the people, mob rule, lynch mob behavior is a kind of dark caricature of popular sovereignty, an evil caricature of popular sovereignty, where it is the people thinking that because we're the people, we get to do whatever we want. And so for Lincoln, Lincoln feared that American democracy might self-destruct, might commit suicide, he said, because of mob rule. But he also said that it was not the mob itself that would bring down our democracy. It was powerful elite, powerful ambitious men exploiting the chaos caused by mob rule, and in that way destroy the republic under the guise of saving it. A Caesar-like figure coming along, pretending to who actually may be stirring up the mob himself, but then pretending to save the country from the effects of mob rule. That was what Lincoln was worried about in 1838, and then this when later he is strongly opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which I won't have time to really explain the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but it basically said we'll let whoever are the first inhabitants of a new territory to decide the status of slavery. That was just a formula for violent mob rule, and in practice, that's what it turned into in these territories. And then when the slave states of the Lower South seceded from the Union before Lincoln had even taken office because they didn't like the election results, Lincoln again saw that as a kind of mob rule on a mass scale. So Lincoln all along had great hope and faith that democracy could address even the most difficult issues, even difficult issues like the future of slavery, if they respected the rules and processes that allowed democracy to work in the first place. If they did not, if people did not respect their own constitutional processes, America's experiment in popular self-government could very well commit suicide. So that kind of great hope and also great fear is with Lincoln from the beginning, and it's connected with the idea of mob rule as a kind of dark caricature of legitimate majority rule.
Let's talk a little about parties.
Okay.
That's a perennial battle, starting with the founders, of course. Are parties good or bad?
Well, I will answer that for Lincoln. Lincoln was very much a supporter of political parties and a builder of political parties. He was a builder of the Whig Party in Illinois during the 1830s and 1840s, and then he became, an important builder of the Republican Party in the 1850s. And there was at that time, just as there is now, many people were very much hostile to political parties. And there's good reasons to be hostile to political parties, especially when you see extremely bad behavior by political parties of the kind that we see today. For Lincoln, however, if you believe in majority rule, if you believe that a majority held in constraint by constitutional checks, changing with deliberate changes of popular opinion and sentiments is the only true sovereign of a free people, somebody needs to organize that majority. Majorities do not occur naturally. And to take an example from Lincoln in the 1850s, Lincoln was convinced that the majority of Americans recognized that slavery was wrong. And certainly the majority of Americans that did not own slaves, he believed implicitly recognized that slavery was wrong. But that did not by itself create any vehicle for those people to come together and act politically. You needed to have a political party that could take a stance on the issue of slavery and for which people could cast their votes in order to turn that sort of implicit, that sort of vague, inchoate moral opposition to slavery into an effective political vehicle. The other thing is these same people who opposed slavery were deeply divided on many other issues. They were divided on economic policy. There were deep divisions on immigration in the 1850s. And so the challenge for Lincoln in putting together a political party is how do you, it, the only way that you could effectively challenge the power, the minority, the great power, overweening power of the slaveholders was to create an effective political party, a majority party that is opposed to slavery. And to do that, you have to effectively organize, you have to resolve or at least finesse the differences, the ways in which people who agree that slavery is wrong but disagree about everything else, you have to enlist them to agree on the main thing and set aside their disagreements on the other things. That's party building in the good sense. And the other thing, additionally, for Lincoln, it was essential for a political party, if it won election, to take some specific step that it could then be either rewarded for or punished, rewarded or punished at the next election. And so the political parties, in that sense, had to be capable not only of stoking outrage, they had to be capable of passing responsible legislation that would improve people's lives. And I think that's one of the main contrasts between how Lincoln understood political parties and the kind of political party behavior that you see today in the United States under our hyper-polarized conditions. I mean, American politics was deeply divided in the 1850s. That's why we had a Civil War. It's deeply divided today. I think much of the political behavior today in political parties involves grandstanding and placing blame. Instead of trying to fix a problem, you let the problem get worse in the hope that the other side will be blamed more for it than you will. That's not how Lincoln understood political parties. The parties he sought to build were political parties that would accomplish something constructive and then go to the voters and be rewarded.
Yeah, I'm wondering if your overall message in the book and all this, which I found fascinating, and gives me a much deeper perspective of what Lincoln faced. I mean, a lot of people have many people felt that, well, he just should have freed the slaves immediately. You counter that argument very.
That was just not possible. That was not possible. Yes.
Anyway, is your overall message a positive one? And we survived, after all, we survived the Civil War, and all is going to be well, and therefore we can overcome anything, or not?
Well, it's easier to be positive about a Civil War when it happened 160 years ago, and you're not living through it yourself. That was an enormous death toll, an enormous economic hit, an enormous disruption of people's lives. I think the positive thing is that Lincoln, what I find most positive about Lincoln is that he believed that majority rule in our democratic system, if we trusted its processes, was capable of resolving or at least containing these deep divisions so that they didn't turn into a civil war. I think that's the positive thing about Lincoln. Maybe slavery was too big for that. I don't think any of our current deep divisions are objectively even comparable to the magnitude of the slavery issue. And so I guess I would say Lincoln's faith that, as he put it in his July 4th, 1861 message to Congress in special sessions, his democratic faith was that all issues could be decided by what he quote, time, discussion, and the ballot box. If we trust the time, discussion, and the ballot box to resolve differences, we will all be better off. I find that a positive message. I think Lincoln believed even the slavery issue could be addressed that way. One can debate whether, this was too big an issue, but I think most issues short of slavery can and ought to be addressed through the democratic process, rather than saying, if you say whatever issue you care about, it's too important to me to trust to the democratic process, then everybody's going to go for their guns for every issue. That everybody can then discover some issue that's too important to be allowed to be trusted to the democratic process. The positive thing is Lincoln was saying, no, the democratic process, if you trust it, is the best way and the only constructive way to address even these deep disagreements.
I'm glad that there's somehow, I too believe that if we could survive that, although it's a very good point, that we don't know what the future bears, but when we read the past, they know what was coming.
Yeah.
It's a big advantage to know what the future is, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Well, I mean, if you actually just look at it, thinking, not knowing the future, would the slaveholders have done what they did if they knew that the end would be that the result would be the destruction of the very institution they were trying to save? And actually, there were Southerners, there were Southern critics of secession that did warn that secession would be followed by civil war, and that could mean the complete destruction of slavery. Yeah. So, in the end, they made a huge gamble. They gambled everything, including the lives of their non-slaveholding neighbors, for something that ended up being an enormous loss. Loss of life and loss in many other ways.
Lincoln made a huge gamble on his end. And if Southern slaveholders and Southerners could see the South today and how much better it is, maybe they would have changed their mind.
Yeah.
I don't want to miss a chance to switch areas here a little bit and talk a little bit about your experience as a writer. We have only a few minutes left. Much of your information in the book comes from secondary or tertiary sources, very difficult sources, but very important sources. Want to talk a little about that?
Well, so I will say that there's really kind of 4 different types of sources that went into this book. I did spend a lot of time looking at original sources, Lincoln's own writings. And in my reading of Lincoln's own writings, I discovered so many things that I had never seen anybody comment on before. Even in documents that had been extensively commenting, I got a lot out of the original sources. But then I will also bring in, and there's like 3 other types of sources. One are biographies of Lincoln. There's many of them. You can't read all of them, but there's some that I read. And then there's works of history, like works about the party systems, works of history about the Dred Scott decision and so on. So I've read many of those. And then finally, and this is really, when you talk about it being a difficult book, there is a lot of political science and democratic political theory in there. Political democratic theorists have spent a lot of time talking about exactly the issues that Lincoln also wrestled with. What makes a majority rule defensible? What makes what makes a majority stable? Some majorities might be unstable. Political scientists look at cases where every majority, the situation can be such that every majority can be immediately voted out by a new majority, and that one voted out by another majority. So there's a lot of literature in political science and in political theory about majority rule that I draw from in my training as a political scientist and a political theorist. I will say one final thing, though, is that I wanted to write a book about Abraham Lincoln for a long time. I've been teaching Lincoln I've been studying Lincoln since college and in grad school, and teaching about Lincoln since the beginnings of my career as a teacher. But I held off on trying to write a book about Lincoln because there was a question, what new could I say? What could I contribute myself to this enormous body of literature? And it finally gradually came to me that my contribution was not some side point from some document that someone discovered in a barn, but what is right in front of us, Lincoln's defense of majority rule, his understanding of majority rule, his defense of it, how he built majorities, that I found was almost, I won't say entirely ignored, but to my knowledge, my book is the only book that on Lincoln that from beginning to end addresses his understanding of majority rule, which was absolutely central to both to his work as a leader and party builder before he was president, and also to his being president.
We only have a couple more minutes, but you've been a historian, a writer. You've played in this game for many years.
Mm-hmm.
How has the craft of writing changed? The researching and writing changed. What new tools helped you, and what do you see coming down the road?
Well, it is good that so many documents have been digitized. That I know there are people that get grants to go to archive somewhere. That sounds like fun, but I've never done that. I've profited from how much of the documents I needed for this have been digitized, and I can access them at home with my laptop without having to get a big grant money. That's the case. I would say, ironically, however, the increased frequency of digital as opposed to written communications will make it difficult for future historians because emails can disappear, databases can be either deleted or just decay. We may not have for future presidents as full a picture that we have of Lincoln because somebody did take those documents actually written on paper that were preserved and then now have been digitally preserved. But I fear that future historians and future political analysts may be deprived of these valuable written records.
On the other hand, a lot of that information will remain, and we see people, much
Yeah.
more with their hair let down or whatever. Anyway, I want to thank you for doing this. It's been very interesting. I've certainly enjoyed it. I hope our audience has.
So
And
I want to thank you for inviting me, and I would just say too about and thank you for forming the Society of Presidential Descendants, uh, and able to hold events like this. And I think that your society can help people remember that American politics was not always as deeply divided and bitter as it is now. Now, in certain times it was clearly, in 1860, American politics was deeply divided and bitter. But, uh, you know, the students that I teach, they have never seen anything they've never experienced anything that I would consider a normal democracy. And so I think looking at the living descendants of politics of previous ages can help us recapture some of the not imperfect. No, it was never been perfect, but some of what is healthy in our political history at a time when we need whatever kind of insight and perspective we can get.
I think you're right. And you have to remember that entering freshmen this year were born in what, '07 or something.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming. Tell you our next session will be on April 16th, where we'll focus on another one of our themes, presidential descendants. We'll be joined by Birch Taylor, whose ancestor is not perhaps who you might think. Birch is the great-great-grandson of Rutherford B. Hayes. So we'll be talking about a forgotten president and what we should remember about it. He will address issues of what historians like you, James, get right and wrong, and what people would remember. We'll be sending out flyers soon, so register to get the links, and we'll get it all going. So everybody, thank you for coming on this beautiful day where I am in Massachusetts, and we'll see you all on April 16th. And we'll look at your chats and respond alike. So thank you all.
Thank you, and to those listening, I welcome your email responses and questions, and I will definitely answer them.
Thank you, everybody.